everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this Sunday morning. We're delighted today to present to you some superb guest speakers on the subject of sovereignty, democracy, and freedom, ahead of a very important vote that's taking place in the UK Parliament on Friday on a private member's bill brought by our first guest note speaker, Jim Allister. Jim Allister is a King's Counsel, a barrister. He's also the MP for North Antrim, having previously represented his constituency in the Assembly of Northern Ireland, and also in the European Parliament, interestingly, for 5 years from 2004 to 2009. Jim's a strong unionist, it would be fair to say, an implacable opponent of the Irish sea border that's been imposed by the EU. And this particular stand was vital in him being returned to Parliament as an MP at the last election, overturning one of the largest majorities in Northern Ireland. He lives in County Antrim, his wife Ruth, and 3 children, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, Jim, on everything you've got to tell us about this key issue, which doesn't just affect Northern Ireland, it resonates around the UK, around Europe, but also these principles apply around the world. So, a great welcome to you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to join you, and good morning or good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for the opportunity. I think when we think about democracy, there's something we take for granted. And it is the fundamental principle that those who are governed should be electing those who govern them. Those who make the laws in any region should be electing those who make those laws. And yet we now, in a part of the United Kingdom, namely Northern Ireland, have the most absurd and undemocratic situation prevailing, whereby in 300 areas of law, the laws in those areas are not made by the Parliament of the United Kingdom. They're not made by the devolved assembly at Stormont. They are made by the European Parliament, a parliament to whom we elect no one, a parliament elected rather by the electors of 27 foreign countries. And yet, under this absurd situation, it is they, not those we elect, who make the laws in those 300 areas. And we're not talking about trifling, incidental laws. We're talking about laws which shape and govern much of the economy of Northern Ireland. We're talking about all the laws that govern our agri-food industry, which is a very important component of our economy. All the laws that govern our trade and much more besides. And all of that is because that was the ridiculous post-Brexit arrangement made for Northern Ireland. You may have heard of the protocol. The protocol is an attachment to the withdrawal agreement. And within it, there is set out clause 5.4, a reference to Annex 2. And Annex 2 sets out 287 EU laws that continue to directly apply to Northern Ireland. And those are the areas over which we have no control. Laws we don't make, laws we can't change, and laws of immense constitutional significance. Because one of those laws is that which subjects Northern Ireland to the EU's customs code. And the EU's customs code, of course, operates on the basis that GB not being a member of the EU is a third or foreign country, but Northern Ireland, being treated as EU territory under the agreement, is treated as exactly that, EU territory. And therefore goods coming from GB, that other part of the United Kingdom, to Northern Ireland have to pass through an international EU-controlled customs border, which partitions the United Kingdom with a border in the Irish Sea. And their goods have to be subjected to, that's the goods coming from GB to Northern Ireland, have to be subjected to customs declarations, customs inspections, pass-through border posts, all because the EU has been allowed to steal authority over Northern Ireland. Indeed, Northern Ireland is treated and regarded legally in that context as EU territory. And that is the huge disenfranchising that has taken place of the people of Northern Ireland, that we're not allowed to elect those who make those laws in that vast number of areas. And that is because under that arrangement, Northern Ireland has been left behind within the EU customs code and within the EU single market for goods. And of course, the 300 areas of law I refer to are all relating to the EU single market for goods. And so instead of being an integral part any longer of the United Kingdom, we have our trade fettered with the United Kingdom through this Irish Sea border. And that caused our Supreme Court, in a case which I with others brought, to have to find that Article 6 of the foundational Acts of Union, which created the United Kingdom and which guaranteed unfettered trade between and within all parts of the United Kingdom, has, by reason of the protocol, or as it's now called, the Windsor Framework, has, by reason of that, been put into suspension. That's why I say this is of immense constitutional significance. And the private members' bill that I'm bringing to the House of Commons on Friday for second reading is designed to directly address this disenfranchising of the people of Northern Ireland and to liberate us from the colonial rule that we now are subject from the EU. In constitutional terms, Northern Ireland is no longer an integral part of the United Kingdom. We are now a condominium because, in part, we are ruled by laws which come from the United Kingdom, the nation to which we belong, and in part, we're ruled by laws which come from a foreign jurisdiction, namely the EU. And that is an intolerable assault, not just upon our constitutional position, but upon our democratic rights as a people, for the reasons I've stated. So my bill, in a number of different phases, will address those issues. Clauses 2 and 5 in particular, I refer to as the liberating clauses, which will liberate Northern Ireland from the flow of EU law, which is governing and shaping our economy. And then the rest of the bill will address the issue of how sensibly, logically, you address the fact that there is an international frontier on the island of Ireland where UK territory ends and EU territory should begin, namely at the Republic of Ireland border. And the proposition is that you would control that trade, which I might say is infinitesimal in terms of the overall trade to and within the EU. It is something like of the order of 0.003% of all the goods that enter the EU enter across from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, which of course remains wholly within the EU. And yet for that infinitesimal amount of goods, we have moved the border to the Irish Sea and subjected all those goods coming into Northern Ireland to that international customs border. And the way to do it instead is to, and you can maintain an invisible border, is to go down the road of what's referred to as mutual enforcement. In other words, anyone who wants to trade with the EU through the Republic of Ireland, well, if you're going to send goods there, then you must send them according to their standards, and vice versa. Those who are sending goods into the United Kingdom from the EU must send them according to Northern Ireland standards and requirements. And each side can mutually enforce the standards, requirements, trade provisions of the other without an international frontier, such as we have at present, and ensure that the passage of goods is monitored in that way. And as the backup to that, you can make it even a criminal offence to send goods from one territory to the other which do not meet the standards and requirements of the recipient country. We don't need an RDC border. We don't need all the apparatus for such a tiny infinitesimal amount of goods as we presently have. And by opting for mutual enforcement and liberating Northern Ireland from the jackboot, I would say, of EU law and colonial rule, then we would strike a blow for the restoration of democracy. And returning to where I started, we would re-establish the fundamental principle that those who are governed should be governed by laws made by those they elect, not by those that other people elect. And that's the sum and substance of it.
Thank you very much for that, Jim. Look, I just want to remind everyone, if they want to jump in with a question, please head down the bottom of Zoom and hit the reactions button and raise your hand so I can see that you're ready. But Jim, I want to start off by firstly saying, from here in Australia, it just completely blows our mind that the Northern Ireland people are separated from Great Britain. Like we just saw the Olympics this year, and Great Britain are competing as one, but it doesn't appear to be governed as one. How did this even happen in the first place? It completely boggles my mind. I know a lot of people here in Australia don't pay attention to Australian politics, let alone British politics and Northern Ireland politics. So maybe for the benefit of the worldwide audience, just fill them in on how we got to this point, but also how do the Northern Ireland people feel about this? Are they supportive that Northern Ireland is currently part of the EU, or is there a lot of pushback?
Well, let's go back to the Brexit referendum in 2016. And the first thing to say about that was, what was the question on the ballot paper? Remembering it was a national vote. It wasn't a regional vote. It was a national vote. And the question was, do you want the United Kingdom to leave the EU? And that question was answered in the affirmative. Different parts of the United Kingdom voted different ways. But that's neither here nor there in the sense it was a national vote. London, for example, voted that they didn't want to leave the EU, but the national vote was. Northern Ireland, by a small majority, voted against Brexit, but so did Scotland. But as part of the United Kingdom, we all should be leaving. But what we find is that what has been done was as if the question was, do you want GB to leave the EU and leave Northern Ireland behind? Because that is what has happened. We have been left behind within the EU's single market and under their customs code. How did that come about? Well, it came about, I would say, by very clever but malevolent diplomacy, essentially from the Republic of Ireland, who, of course, traditionally has always wanted to see what they call the reunification of Ireland. In other words, Northern Ireland being extracted from the UK and assimilated into the entirety of the island of Ireland. And that has never happened because it's the will of the greater number in Northern Ireland that they should stay part of the United Kingdom. But here was an opportunity which was seized upon by the EU, who of course were very angry that any member state would dare to leave. And indeed, it was infamously recorded by the chief EU negotiator that Northern Ireland would be the price of Brexit, not just to punish the United Kingdom, but as an example to other member states who might dare to think that they too could leave the EU. So it was a deliberate, conscious assertion and annexation, effectively, of Northern Ireland as a lesson to others. You don't leave the EU or we punish you in a way which disrupts your own territory. And remember this, the withdrawal agreement whereby the UK left is an international legal agreement. But there's a fundamental principle of international law, and it is that parties which are making agreements are required to respect the territorial integrity of each other. That there's been no respect for the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom by virtue of the deal which was done with the EU. It was signed foolishly, I would say, by the government at the time. I think at the time, I suspect Boris Johnson, who always, I think, had the mentality, well, what's today's problem? We'll sort today's problem and then we'll worry about it afterwards. I think that there was a belief that this would be a temporary arrangement, that it could be changed thereafter. But of course, that hasn't happened. And now we're left solidifying in this position whereby Northern Ireland is annexed out for all those areas of law into the EU, and therefore our constitutional position has been undermined. So, yeah, it was the post-Brexit arrangements which put us in this pickle, and something that certainly I have my mission as a politician to try and reverse. And that's why this bill on Friday is such an important step in that regard.
I can only imagine how frustrated and perplexed you were when you first learnt that this was going to be the case. But we've got our first question. Lorena, you've got your hand up. Feel free to ask your question to Jim.
Okay. Thank you very much. And first of all, I look forward to listening to Mr. Allister's speech in the Commons. My question is about the common agriculture policy in the EU. We've seen that with this policy, farming communities, this policy believes that all farming communities across Europe are to be treated in the same way, which is nonsense, because the effects of this policy in farming communities across some of the European countries have been devastating for family farms and small farms. We've seen that here in the north of Spain, where many farmers have had to throw their products, and that has been, terrible for them. So my question is, if this policy still applies to Northern Ireland. We've now seen, of course, that the Labour government in the UK has created this new family farm tax, which is also, I would like to know how it's going to affect farming communities in Northern Ireland, and basically what's going to happen to these small farming communities if with EU policy.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, the Common Agricultural Policy as an entity doesn't any longer apply to Northern Ireland. But what does apply is all effectively most of the rules under it, which govern how you conduct your agriculture. All the agri-food laws are still coming from the EU to be imposed in Northern Ireland. So it de facto applies in significant measure. The aspect that doesn't apply is it doesn't apply any funding, such as was the other side of the cap policy. So we no longer have the single farm payments, as we used to call them, from the EU. That now comes from British Exchequer funds, but the bind of all their legislation still is applicable to our agriculture. On the question of the abolition of the exemption on inheritance tax, that will hit family farms very, very hard. Indeed, land prices in Northern Ireland on average are significantly higher than they are in the rest of GB. So having set a threshold at £1 million, it will take less acreage, less hectares in Northern Ireland to reach the threshold than it will in any other part of the United Kingdom. So it will kick in harder in that regard. And yes, most of our farms are family farms, passing from one generation to the next. So when you have a situation that upon death there will be huge death duties, then the only way to often raise those, because farms may be asset rich, but they're not cash rich, the only way to raise those death duties will be by partitioning, selling off part of the farm, and that will be very detrimental both to the efficiency of the farm going forward and to the heritage of the farm in terms of passing it from one generation to the next. So that is another burden that we're having to face and trying to resist with the current British government, which is a great difficulty going forward.
Thanks, Jim. Bruce Goodwin has had his hand up for a few minutes. Bruce, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lee. Jim, thanks very much for your talk. Very interesting. Apologies, I wanted to broaden the discussion, if I may. I know you've been talking principally about trade, but as a matter of sovereignty, democracy and freedom, the debate on whether or not the UK should leave the ECHR and how that might affect the Good Friday Agreement is one that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, particularly in view of the fact that when the Good Friday Agreement was first signed in, I think it was 1998, later that year, the ECHR was inserted into the Human Rights Act, which I believe was to normalise the whole of the UK. So in that instance, the whole of the UK was dragged into that situation, and I wonder if, you know, our Lords and Masters, it's not the first time the Northern Ireland has been used as an instrument of, abuse.
That's a very important point, and there's a number of issues I want to respond to in that regard. Yes, under the Belfast Agreement or Good Friday Agreement, there is adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights, but of course the EU, being the EU, had to have more than that. So it then had its own Charter of Fundamental Rights, and Northern Ireland is still subject to that under the protocol or withdrawal arrangements. And that has given rise to an expansionist view been taken in the courts. So let me give you two examples. The United Kingdom Parliament, supposedly sovereign, passed two laws. Now, whether you agreed with them or not, they were the will of a sovereign parliament. One of them was in relation to legacy issues in Northern Ireland, and which would have drew a line in respect of historic prosecutions. The second was the famous or infamous Rwanda Bill. Now, in both cases, the courts in Northern Ireland ruled that neither of those aspects could operate in Northern Ireland. Why? Because Northern Ireland was still subject to the requirements of Article 2 of the protocol, which places under the various human rights obligations of the EU. To take the Rwanda one, there are enhanced rights for refugees and asylum seekers under the Charter for Fundamental Freedoms and within EU law. So the idea that you could export or remove to Rwanda or anywhere else refugees, if it didn't comply with the relevant EU law, then you couldn't do it in Northern Ireland because we're treated as EU territory. So our courts, which are quite expansionist in this regard, ruled that struck down that law, a law of a sovereign United Kingdom Parliament for a part of the United Kingdom, struck it down. So that's a living example of how the clutches of the EU continue to control and indeed to override the will of the sovereign parliament of the United Kingdom. So the fact that we are still tethered to all the plethora of EU human rights law is a further distancing of us from the provisions which apply elsewhere in the United Kingdom. From my own point of view, I don't think we need to be in the ECHR. I think the answer to that is for the United Kingdom as a sovereign entity to have its own human rights legislation, which should apply equally to all parts of the United Kingdom. And that's the way I would take it, rather than subjecting ourselves to the idiosyncrasies and others of others across the EU. So I think it is a fundamental problem, and it's one which has been brought home very sharply to us in tandem with the protocol arrangements as to just how far we are under the control of the EU.
Thanks for that, Jim. Now, I just want to remind the audience, Jim is on a tight schedule, so if you do have a question, now's the time. Just remember to put your hand up and so I can see you. But I want to turn the discussion to immigration now. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, said recently that Brexit was used to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders. And obviously, the whole immigration issue in the UK is massive at the moment. If Northern Ireland are still in the EU, you would think that they would be immune from that, going by what Keir Starmer has said. Is that the case?
No, I think we're in the worst of all positions because, and I take you back to the discussion about Rwanda. When our High Court ruled that the Rwanda bill could not apply in Northern Ireland, but could apply in GB. Now, if it was a workable scheme, and if it was a scheme which had in fact come into operation, of course the election, Kaiboy stat, but if it had come into operation, what do you think the consequences would have been? Northern Ireland would have become the haven within the UK for asylum seekers. Because if you had the High Court ruling that you can't remove them from Northern Ireland because of its objection to EU standards, but you could remove them from England, Scotland, or Wales, where do you think they would go? That's an indication of the disparity and folly of where we are. And then add into that mix that in the British Isles, we have something called the Common Travel Area. In other words, wherever you arrive lawfully into the British Isles, you can then travel freely within the British Isles, which means that there's freedom of movement within the British Isles. So if you add that to the mix of illegal immigrants coming in, you can see how, with no border on the island of Ireland, that it can become a gateway, or in other circumstances, a refuge for immigrants. So it could have proved to be, under the Rwanda policy, a dire situation for Northern Ireland, and could yet, if GB goes in a different direction on immigration, which offends the precious EU principles, then it could indeed continue to be under a different, de facto under a different immigration regime.
Stephen, do you mind if I just butt in for one moment with a point of information for our global audience? It isn't always obvious to to the citizens of the United Kingdom, that around the world people can get slightly confused about what is the United Kingdom, what is GB. So let me just explain very briefly for our global audience. When Jim refers to GB, he's talking about England, Scotland, and Wales, not Northern Ireland. Now, the correct definition of the United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the key thing is that that is our sovereign nation. We have a king who presides over the United Kingdom. So GB, when Jim refers to it, is only referring to 3 of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. So I just wanted to make that clear for our global audience. That's all.
Yeah. The official title of the UK is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And it all goes back to 2 historic acts of union, one in 1707, which brought Scotland in, and one in 1800, which brought in then the whole of Ireland, but subsequently Northern Ireland only. And there were 2 fundamental principles in that. Article 3 of the Acts of Union established a single sovereign parliament for the whole United Kingdom. That's Westminster. Article 6 of the Acts of Union established free and unfettered trade, an economic union for the whole United Kingdom. And it is that latter which has, of course, been put into suspension, according to the Supreme Court, by reason of a protocol, because you can't have free and unfettered trade between and within all parts of the United Kingdom if you put a border in the Irish Sea. If you say one part is subject to the customs code of a foreign jurisdiction. So that's why that fundamental foundational Article 6 of the Acts of Union is in suspension. And that, of course, causes gross constitutional offence to me and others who believe in the integrity, the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom.
Now, I just want to let everyone know that the TUV party, which stands for the Traditional Unionist Voice, if our international audience was wondering what TUV stands for, Jim Allister is the leader of that party, and they currently have this website, restoretheunion.co.uk, which you can go to and support the bill that they are proposing. And if you scroll down to this point here, there's 3 letters, and they're templates that you can use. You can choose which template you would like, and you can send your letter into your local MP to support the bill that is happening on December 6th. So just to point that out, restoretheunion.co.uk. Please support everything that Jim is doing and also that the TUV is doing. Do you want to make any comments on that? Jim, to encourage people to send in the letters?
I would. Obviously, a Friday is not a day that Parliament normally sits. It's a day when MPs generally devote themselves to constituency clinics, etc. And of course, this Friday just passed, we had a huge debate about assisted suicide. And that, I think almost every MP was there for that. So following the next Friday with my bill is an unfortunate piece of timing, in that to expect MPs to come back in 2 successive Fridays is quite an ask. So that is why we are encouraging constituents in GB to encourage their MP to be there, to vote on these issues and to support the bill. I'm happy to say that all the Unionist MPs that represent Northern Ireland are co-sponsors on my bill, as are Sir Ian Duncan Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party, and Graham Stringer, a renowned Labour Brexiteer, and Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are also signatories on the face of my bill. So it does have a broad sweep of what you could classify as unionist support. and it's a question of then trying to engender MPs who don't have to be there on a Friday to come and to vote. So that's the purpose of the website, to give people the opportunity to encourage their MP to come and support this bill. And let's fix the foundations. You know, since July, we've heard a lot of talk from the Labour government about fixing the foundations. Well, there's no more important foundation that needs fixed than that, relating to Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
Okay, so we've got a question in the chat from Bruce Goodwin. If we leave the ECHR, I'm probably saying that wrong, what repercussions, solutions will there be on the Belfast Agreement?
Well, if the United Kingdom legislates for its own human rights law, then I don't see any consequences for the Belfast Agreement. Of course, the Belfast Agreement was entered at a time when Northern Ireland and GB and the Republic of Ireland were all in the EU, were all signatories to the ECHR, but that is not a binding prohibition on any adherent to the ECR making their own arrangements. And I don't see that it would be an impossible situation. I think it could be dealt with. But of course, there's maybe a more fundamental point about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It was premised on the fact that Northern Ireland was and is and can continue to be a part of the United Kingdom so long as its people so wish. And yet, without anyone's consent from within Northern Ireland, we've been put in this adjunct position of a condominium, now no longer ruled as a full part of the United Kingdom, but in part ruled by a foreign jurisdiction. So that's a change which has occurred despite the Belfast Agreement, and it's something which means that the Belfast Agreement is not an impediment to change, nor would it be an impediment to us changing our adherence to the ECHR.
Now, our next question is coming all the way from Australia. Mr. Anthony Carr, fire away, mate.
Okay, I've got two questions. First of all, on what grounds is an act suspended? I find that an extraordinary thing that the court can discover that because the act is in conflict with another act, then the earlier act is suspended. I find it weird. The other question is, what sort of response are you getting from the Conservative Party? Are they going to do anything, or are they as useless as they normally are on these matters? Sorry, I'm being blunt.
Well, on the first point, the problem for us as to how it can be that the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is required to hold that a foundational part of the very acts of union is in suspension. The reason why that arises is because supremacy has been given to EU law. We have something known as Section 7A of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which created supreme flow of EU law into effect in Northern Ireland. And therefore, when it was in conflict with what was already in law, the court held that the EU provisions establishing the Irish Sea border, etc., had supremacy, and therefore that which said otherwise was, so long as that prevailed, in suspension. And that's how we get to this absurd and unbelievable position that a foundational principle of the United Kingdom is put into suspension by EU law, which is flowing with supremacy into Northern Ireland. That's why my bill in Clause 2 would seek to override that and to restore the supremacy of the acts of union. It's a bit like the when we joined the EU, the 1972 Act gives supremacy to EU law over UK law. Well, that in respect of Northern Ireland, for all the subject areas that we've discussed, is the same now by virtue of that Section 7A. So that's the reason. As the Conservative Party, well, They are the Conservative and Unionist Party, or so they tell us. So obviously I seek to test them on that. Serene Duncan-Smith, as I've said, the former leader, is a co-sponsor of this bill. I have had discussions with their chief whip. I'm meeting their Northern Ireland, indeed the deputy leader, effectively, Alec Burkhardt, on Monday to discuss it. I have support from various other individuals, but do I think the Conservative Party officially are going to support my bill? Sadly, I don't think so, but I certainly am putting it up to them very strongly. And I believe that anyone who believes in the title of their own party, Conservative and Unionist Party, should be there on Friday to demonstrate that by voting for the restoration of the union in respect of that part which has been semi-abandoned.
Thanks for that, Jim. Now, to let the audience know, if you're wondering how do I get involved in one of these Zoom calls, you need to sign up to the mailing list at factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. Join the mailing list of one of those platforms and you'll get the Zoom link to be able to participate in one of these in the future. But Jim, I want to ask you a question about the TUV party itself. Now, you founded that in 2007 and you are the leader of that party. Now, you split from the Democratic Unionist Party, otherwise known as the DUP. Looking back, has that separation worked? I know here in Australia we have a big problem with a lot of right-leaning minor parties, and it's splitting the vote here. Is it a similar thing in Northern Ireland, or are you happy with what you've done over the last few years?
Well, I think apart from our own success, I think part of the consequence of the existence of TUV has probably applied some pressure to the DUP to keep reasonably close to some of the founding principles of unionism. But, I don't want to diverge too much, but the reason I left the DUP and formed TUV was, in principle, I fundamentally disagreed with the DUP's decision to go into government with IRA Sinn Féin. And that's what sparked the arrangement. We then laterally had an arrangement reached under when Sir Geoffrey Donaldson was the leader of the DUP, whereby they agreed a document with the government, grandly called Safeguarding the Union, and tried to tell us that that had abolished the Irish Sea border, which of course it hadn't. And on that premise, they ended their protest against the protocol in as far as Stormont was concerned. And that, I think, was a wrong move. But yeah, look, there are differences. But as I stressed again, on this bill, this has unified all unionists. And that's where I'd like it to be and where I'd like it to stay, because I think it is important that, there's nothing more fundamental than are we or are we not a full proper part of the United Kingdom. And one of the striking things about this whole discussion about the protocol, or Windsor Framework as it's now called, is that there's not a single elected unionist representative who supports it. Now, Northern Ireland is supposed to operate since the Belfast Agreement on a cross-community basis. Under the Belfast Agreement, you cannot take a key decision without cross-community support. What does that mean? That means you need a majority from the unionist side and a majority from the nationalist side to endorse anything significant. That has been removed as far as the protocol is concerned. There is no, will be, I believe, no unionist consent to these arrangements. They are only supported by nationalists. And of course, let's understand why they are supported by nationalists. Because, the IRA bombed, butchered, ran a terrorist campaign for decades and failed where the protocol succeeded. They failed to push the border to the Irish Sea. Along comes Brexit and these arrangements and the border is pushed to the Irish Sea. So that enables nationalism to see in a more enhanced way the island of Ireland as a single entity. And when, and this is a very important point, all those 300 areas of law that I talked about, which are made in Europe, which shape and control our economy, are of course the identical laws which apply in the Irish Republic. Because the Irish Republic belongs to the EU, so it democratically has subjected itself to EU control. Fair enough. But now, in all those areas touching upon those aspects of our economy, we in Northern Ireland live under the identical laws, not of the rest of the United Kingdom, but the identical laws that apply in the Irish Republic. And of course, nationalism is enthusiastic about that because it sees that as a stepping stone to creating an all-Ireland economically, which itself is a stepping stone to creating an all-Ireland politically, because it's a relatively short step from economic unity to political unity. And that is the malevolent intent of the protocol, to, by stealth, create an all-Ireland entity, which then will consummate the breakup of the United Kingdom by creating the circumstances for an all-Ireland politic. That's why unionism is so opposed to it, and why nationalism is at ease with the current arrangements, even though it removes from themselves the right to make those laws. They're happy to see laws made which are the same laws as the Irish Republic, because that's better than British laws if you're a nationalist.
Okay, I can see Lee with his hand up there, but I've got a question in the chat that has been sitting there for a little while. So this is from Alan. I don't quite understand what this means, so hopefully, Jim, you'll be able to understand this question. Does Northern Ireland, aka Ulster, not suffer from an assumption that at one point in the past we were ruled by Dublin? We never were. That was the question.
Yes. Yes, historically, that is correct. When you go back through time, when Ireland was last united, it was under British rule. And then those of the 26 counties of the Irish Republic decided over 100 years ago that they were leaving the United Kingdom. They were perfectly entitled to do that, but they didn't have they shouldn't have been allowed to have an expectation or a requirement that we would have to leave with them. So they decided to exit the United Kingdom and to ultimately establish the Republic of Ireland. But it is an historical fact that the whole island of Ireland was last ruled under British rule until the Irish Republic decided to exit that situation. So, yeah, I understand the point the gentleman is making.
Okay, we'll get some questions lined up, so we might make these as quick as possible. We'll bring in our chairman, Lee. Go for it.
Let's pass to AJJ McDonald, who's had a hand up for a long time, and I'll ask mine after that.
Okay, go ahead, AJ.
Hello, Mr. Allister, great big admirer up here in Scotland. As I understand it, the Windsor Framework makes the Northern Ireland Protocol much worse, for example, with the removal of the trade diversion protection. And it is my belief that there has been substantial diversion of trade away from the GB to... am I correct in this?
Absolutely, particularly with small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, because Northern Ireland had an economy very integrated with the GB economy, because that's where we get our raw materials from. Now, big business is better able to cope with paperwork and bureaucracy than small business. So since the imposition of the Irish Sea border, we have had many, many small businesses which have simply stopped supplying Northern Ireland because it's too much hassle. It's too much hassle to have to fill in customs declarations and endless paperwork. So you just say, I'll not bother. So I stop selling. And time again, when you go to buy something online, it will come up not available in Northern Ireland. Why? Because the supplier isn't prepared to go through the endless bureaucratic hoops of sending it to Northern Ireland. So that is a definite curb. And of course, in consequence, there is diversion of trade. And now Northern Ireland's trade is orientating by compulsion towards an all-Ireland trade, which of course was the goal of the protocol, and disintegrating us from the GB market. And so you're absolutely right. It is having a consequence, particularly in small business between and within the United Kingdom.
Yes, and my point is that in part that the Windsor Framework makes it far worse because you no longer have that protection. But could I lob in another point, and that is on the 13th of December, the EU's safety regulation comes into force, which is an absolute nightmare, in particular for small businesses and individual traders. And you are actually seeing, and it, in a way, it is a shame that it's coming into force after your bill, because it will cause a lot of, I would say, concern or anger against the EU, EU-wide, but also within Northern Ireland.
Yes, you're right. That legislation is going to be another lever prizing us away from the GB market, making it much more difficult. And, we've had some ludicrous examples. And, anyone in this global audience will probably be astounded to hear that to now bring your pet with you from GB to Northern Ireland to visit relatives, to visit Giant's Causeway, to visit any of our tourist attractions. If you want to visit Northern Ireland from England, Scotland, and Wales with your pet, you have to now have a pet passport. You have to be logged into a Northern Ireland pet scheme. You have to have your pet chipped according to EU law. Why? Because the EU has specifically legislated for the United Kingdom the requirement for pet passports. And something I was recently railing against in Parliament. And it's a small but very significant indication of just how much we have come under the grip of EU control when even FIDO is affected by EU regulations in this way. And the 13th of December watershed is going to add to that even further and further down the line in relation to parcels and all sorts of things.
Okay, next up is Lee Evans.
Yeah, Jim, thank you. Fascinating talk so far. I'm aware we're going slightly over time, but I appreciate your time on this incredibly important issue ahead of the vote on Friday. What I'm interested in would be now to know what you think will be the result on Friday, because from where I sit, there isn't a cat's chance in hell that this vote your bill will pass. Nevertheless, I think it's incredibly important that you move that bill on Friday and that it's debated. But can you just give our international audience a feel for the fact that after Friday, after your bill, Northern Ireland will continue to be disenfranchised as an integral part of the United Kingdom?
Yes, sadly, no doubt that the Labour government, with its huge majority, will crush this bill. I have no doubt about that. But it is important to use the platform that a private member's bill gives me to articulate all these issues and to put it up to government and indeed to every MP. And, I will simply say to every MP in the United Kingdom, how would you feel if your constituents were governed by laws that you can't make and you can't change, would you be so blasé about it? Or would you stand up for them? And that's really the challenge. Going forward, I think there are opportunities. The election of President Trump could bring an interesting dimension, because if he delivers on his threat of tariffs, the United Kingdom, more than ever, will need a trade deal. But Mr. Trump is not a big fan of the EU. And if he did a trade deal with the UK in present circumstances, he would see the goods that he sends able to pass freely into the EU through the back door of Northern Ireland because of the lack of controls for what passes through. So Mr. Trump might have a part to play in saying to the British government, if you want a trade deal, then you need to shut the back door into the EU, because I'm not giving the EU a trade deal. And so there are other opportunities to deal with this issue. And that's something that I think the British government should be beginning to think about, because if those tariffs come in, they will need a trade deal. And if he's not giving a trade deal with the EU, and I suspect he won't, then why would he give one which can be circumvented by a protocol which loads the goods on into the EU?
Okay, let's squeeze in one more question. It's in the chat from Peter. Why would any British government do what the IRA could never do with their terrorist campaign and put a border in the Irish Sea and send the British Army who fought and died and to defeat the IRA to defend Northern Ireland and then just give it up by the stroke of a pen?
Well, that is a sad commentary on where we are. That as I said, and the caller has repeated, the protocol achieved for the IRA failed. That's the harsh reality. It pushed the border to the Irish Sea, and that is very hard for me, for any unionist, and particularly for those who lost relatives at the hands of a terrorist campaign. That's very hard to come to terms with. And that's why I think unionists will never come to terms with this partitioning Irish Sea border, and why we will not give up the struggle to see the equilibrium restored to our position within the United Kingdom. It's something that affects our very existence, and something that is part of our birthright, and something, therefore, that we must defend and will defend. And I see this bill as an opportunity to require reflection on what have we done to part of our own United Kingdom when we give the very outcome that terrorism failed to achieve.
That's probably a good way to finish with our time with you today, Jim Allister, leader of TUV. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. And I much appreciate the opportunity. Dan is going to carry on, and we'll deal with a number of issues, I'm sure. Maybe also illustrate to you how, as a consequence of the arrangements with Northern Ireland, the knock-on effect is that, in fact, GB is being sucked back under EU control, which I think, of course, is also a very important dimension. But thank you for the opportunity. Much appreciated. And I'm going to head on, if that's okay.
No problem at all. I'll bring in Lee.
Thank you.
Lee Evans to take us over into our next speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, can I thank my friend Jim Allister, a magnificent spokesman for the cause, who I think has raised a whole lot of issues that will resonate around the world, not just in the UK, not just in Northern Ireland, not just in GB, but around the world. How would Americans feel if, for example, Texas had laws determined by Mexico that they could neither affect nor vote on, nor have any control over whatsoever. It's unimaginable that any American government, let alone one led by Donald Trump, would accept such a thing. When it comes to the other side of the world, which I know a little bit about, can Australians imagine Western Australia, Perth, for example, being governed by laws from Indonesia? I don't think so. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And yet, what you've done for us, Jim, is summed up that situation in the United Kingdom. So this isn't just an issue for us, although it's incredibly important. It is a totemic issue, in my opinion, around the world. And to move that further along, we have another good friend of mine, Dan Boucher. Dan is a stalwart. He's been fighting away for some considerable time on these issues. He's got a PhD in, would you believe, sovereignty and international relations, which makes him pretty well qualified to talk about those issues today. He's the author of a great book, The Big Society in a Small Country. He was previously a member of the Conservative Party, but via the DUP, he's now moved along. Couldn't reconcile himself with the Northern Ireland Protocol, stood on principle against that, so resigned from the Conservative Party. And he was dismayed by the latest safeguarding the union deal, quote unquote, that the DUP did with the last UK government. He's widely published in all sorts of places, and I'd like to welcome Dan Boucher to give us his views. Dan, we're running a little late, so if you can keep it concise, that would be good.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lee. It's a great pleasure to be here and a privilege to have been invited. I'm speaking to you from the port town of Larne in County Antrim in Northern Ireland, which is a significant place for these discussions because it's one of the places where, at the moment, border control posts are being literally concreted in to give effect to the Irish Sea border. We've been talking about it as if it's sort of fully already here, but it's important to remember that while it is partly here, it is not yet fully here. And so we don't actually fully comprehend what the consequences of it are because we're not actually living fully with those consequences yet. The border control posts won't actually be completed and ready, subject, I suppose, to potential delays, until July 2025, and it's only then that we'll really see the imposition fully of this international customs border, an international phytosanitary border. And Larne is one of those places where that has all been cemented in. But as you can tell from my accent and also by way of Lee's kind introduction, I'm actually from Dorset on the south coast of England. And I was a member of the Conservative Party until 2021 and was unable to reconcile myself to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which when I read I was appalled by. And I was appalled by it not only because of the way that it negatively affects part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, effectively disenfranchising 1.9 million people, the biggest kickback, I guess, against democracy, because obviously the people of Northern Ireland had been fully enfranchised for 100 years, and now the value of the vote in Northern Ireland has effectively been degraded because we can no longer stand for election to make all the laws to which we are subject. And I just felt that was an extraordinary thing to take place, a terrible thing to happen to the people of Northern Ireland. But I've never really bought into the idea that it's possible for a country like the United Kingdom, that is a union, that is as all countries are, effectively a moral community, for 3 parts of it to acquiesce, for the 4th part of it to be treated as Northern Ireland has, and to allow an outside player to effectively require the disenfranchisement of some of your people. I don't think you can allow that to happen and for it not to have a negative effect on everyone, because I think that the moral community that is the United Kingdom is whole cloth. And I think some people have looked at it and have taken the view that it's okay to effectively make Northern Ireland a means to an end, to enable GB to get Brexit, even though Northern Ireland won't, and for the UK to be able to carry on happily thereafter in terms of England, Wales and Scotland. I think that there is a breaking of faithfulness in the act that resulted in agreeing to and acquiescing with this arrangement. And I think that strong nations are predicated on a strong sense of interdependent belonging, which brings with it a clear sense of obligation and duty between the different constituent parts of the nation, whatever nation it is. And I feel that the whole of the United Kingdom has been profoundly weakened and enfeebled morally as a consequence of embracing this compromise. And it's something that I haven't been able to reconcile myself to. It's something that I'm committed to fighting against indefinitely, because I fear that unless and until this situation is put right, that it will be bad news for England, Wales and Scotland, as well as bad news for Northern Ireland. Effectively, effectively Brexit was supposed to be about taking back control. And there's a sense in which the Brexit arrangements that the UK government have submitted to are more humiliating to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland than was membership of the European Union, because they have resulted in part of our country being made into what is effectively a colony of the EU, and our country being divided by the application of an international customs and phytosanitary border, a border that crucially we, the United Kingdom, do not govern. That border is governed at the end of the day. Its rules are governed by the European Union. And this inevitably has a very negative effect, I think, on the standing of the United Kingdom as an entity on the world stage, and sends out a sort of a message of a lack of commitment to each other, a readiness to be divided by outside forces, and a lack of resolution to stand up as an entity for the people of the United Kingdom, treating everyone as equal. And I think that although it was that kind of moral concern, I have to say that in the first instance really concerned me. I thought it was highly ironic. The Good Friday Agreement essentially was a mechanism whereby people were, there was an attempt to try and persuade people who had a small minority of people who'd been tempted to engage in giving up on democracy in favour of turning to, if you like, from the ballot box to the bomb. Highly ironic that this is the one part of the British Isles where actually the value of the vote has been degraded. If you live in England, Wales or Scotland or in the Republic of Ireland, you have the right to stand for election to make all the laws to which you are subject. Northern Ireland, because of the protocol and the intervention of the European Union, is the one part of the British Isles where we have a lesser citizenship, where the value of the vote and the ballot box it has been allowed to be eroded, which is the last thing if you were to pick anywhere. I mean, it would be wrong to do it anywhere, but if you were to pick somewhere to do it, Northern Ireland would probably be the last place you choose, given its troubled history and the need to keep faith with the ballot box and with the democratic process. But I think the second, whilst I was initially moved very much by, I guess, that those sort of moral concerns, I think that there are more practical concerns, I think, for the rest of the United Kingdom as well, which are now becoming, apparently you do the wrong thing, then it doesn't take too long for practical consequences to flow from that aren't in your interest. Obviously, for those of you who followed the Brexit debate carefully, there were 3 votes by Parliament on different articulations of what was called the backstop, which essentially would have resulted in the whole of the United Kingdom being kept in the European Union single market. And absolutely rightly, the British Parliament on 3 successive occasions rejected that, because the whole rationale for Brexit was not to give control away, it was to take back control. It was to say that we want to make our own laws. And of course, there was a sense in which, when we were part of the European Union, in which we were involved in making those laws, because we had representation in the Council of Ministers and representation in the European Parliament. But the difficulty was, of course, that we could be overruled. We could be overruled by qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers and majority voting in the European Parliament, and that the European Court of Justice could find against us whenever it wanted to as well. And that was the basis of the democratic deficit, and why the United Kingdom voted to leave the UK. So obviously the proposition of actually remaining in the European single market, subject to its laws but not having a role in making them, was a perverse solution. And so very rightly Parliament voted against it. But essentially what the protocol involved doing was voting for that for Northern Ireland. And essentially saying we will happily, well, not necessarily happily, but we will allow Northern Ireland to be disenfranchised, and the rest of us, England, Wales, and Scotland, can make our own laws. And what we're seeing now is that even though the backstop was rejected, we are seeing something like the backstop coming into effect, because the European Union realizes that if Great Britain embraces all the opportunities of Brexit, which involve it diverging from the EU, that it will diverge from Northern Ireland, which will become very difficult to manage for so long as Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom. And so they are seeking to use Northern Ireland through the protocol in exactly the same way that they were seeking to use it through the backstop, in the sense of trying to place constraint on Great Britain and prevent Great Britain from actually developing laws that are different from those of the European Union. And interestingly, since the summer, we've seen a number of pieces of legislation come before Parliament that have been very much about giving effect to this. So the Product Safety and Metrology Bill, for example, we had references were made earlier to the general product safety regulations that are coming into force in Northern Ireland on the 13th of December. The Product Safety and Metrology Bill, which is currently before Parliament at the moment, is going to some significant degree, try and catch up with the EU, so that GB is not out of alignment with NI, and therefore not out of alignment with the rest of the EU. We also saw the Windsor Framework Retail Movement Scheme Regulations 2024, for example, that were introduced in August, which effectively require that goods coming into the United Kingdom from the rest of the world, or coming to Great Britain, I should say, from the rest of the world, must be subject to EU standards in the same way that they must be if they come into Northern Ireland, in order to align Great Britain with Northern Ireland, and therefore align Great Britain with the European Union. And then, interestingly, there was a debate in Parliament recently on the Radio Equipment Amendment Regulations 2024, and a number of people expressed concern about them because they imposed a law in Northern Ireland that didn't apply to the rest of Great Britain, and they talked about divergence. And the government's defence was to say, don't worry, we are going to introduce exactly the same law in Great Britain too shortly. And so we're seeing very, very clearly the impact of Northern Ireland being used to try and sabotage, or I should say, the failure to allow Brexit to happen in Northern Ireland, to sabotage Brexit more generally. And this is why the bill that is coming before Parliament this week is so important, not just for people living in Northern Ireland, but hugely important for people who believe in Brexit, who live in England, Wales, and Scotland as well. And I think that for people that are listening to this who live in England, Wales, or Scotland, I guess our plea to you would be, please do visit the Restore the Union website, please do write to your MP, because one of our concerns is that England, Wales and Scotland MPs just won't turn up. We really need them to do that on Friday. We really need them to know that this is an issue that matters to their constituents in England, their constituents in Wales, their constituents in Northern Ireland, because it isn't just, in Scotland, because it isn't just a Northern Ireland issue. It impacts all of us.
Dan,
yeah.
Can I just stop you there, because I believe, I don't know, Stephen, if you can tell us, but I believe that our next speaker, who's only got a very, very limited time, should have joined by now. I don't know if you can see him. He's
yes, he's here waiting.
Right. And would you mind very much if we interrupted you? And I know that Ben is very short on time. And would you mind if we resume after we hear from Ben Habib,
okay.
who I'm sure people will have lots of questions for. I can see Ben now. Hello, Ben.
Morning.
Good to see you.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry to cut Dan short. Dan, many apologies. That wasn't my intention. No,
you're always a perfect gentleman, Ben, but I just felt that knowing Dan as I do, he wouldn't mind knowing that you are pressed for time, because I know that our global audience wants to hear from you. So why don't you fire away on this issue? And I'm afraid you're going to have some questions about the news from that you announced last week as well. But I hope you can take both.
Absolutely. I mean, I won't go, I don't think, into much detail on Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the manner in which it's being used effectively, not just to rip Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom, which I think it actually has already done at least from a legal perspective, and the way that it's being used to prevent the United Kingdom from actually leaving the EU. You know, the Northern Ireland Protocol, as I'm sure Jim and Dan have brilliantly explained, is like a regulatory grappling hook into the flesh of Great Britain, as distinct from United Kingdom, via Northern Ireland into Great Britain, to prevent it from leaving the EU. And ultimately, the United Kingdom can't leave the EU. It can't kick off the shackles of the liberal global order as manifested through the EU and the control of the United Kingdom unless it gets rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. In fact, actually, the withdrawal agreement, which was the agreement pursuant to which we left the EU, and then the subsequent trade and cooperation agreement that Boris Johnson signed up, that he banged the drum about so enthusiastically as being a fantastic, wonderful agreement. Both those agreements need to be terminated. Both those treaties need to be terminated if the United Kingdom is genuinely to become an independent, sovereign, democratic country, and to kick off the shackles, as I was saying, of this liberal global order, which stands, I think, in direct opposition to nation states and the ability for nation states to govern themselves. In other words, undermining our democracies. And that's probably all I want to say, I think. I'd love questions. Questions would be much more interesting to me, I think, Lee.
Yeah, and I am quite sure that people have them. I know I certainly do, but let's open it up to the audience. Stephen is monitoring as we go. We have a question for you already from Spain, from a political scientist there, from Lorena. If you don't mind me stepping in, Stephen, I'll suggest that we take Lorena's question next.
Okay.
Lorena,
do you hear me?
you.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. My question is about illegal immigration and problematic of the new Labour government plan on keeping migrants in hotels, and what are the alternatives to these new policies by Keir Starmer?
Keir Starmer's policies, no matter how he may describe them, don't we have no chance whatsoever of stopping illegal migration from France to the United Kingdom. So just to summarize what his policies are, the first policy, which he announced with great fanfare, was the new Border Security Command, which was the bringing together of 5 domestic British agencies, the Crown Prosecution Service, MI5, Border Force, the immigration something or the other. Anyway, I can't remember the name of the 5 in aggregate, but 5 domestic bodies. And it was charged with using anti-terror type laws to break the people smuggling gangs. And that sounds all fantastic. But of course, if you've only got domestic British agencies involved, you can't possibly break the smuggling gangs, because the smuggling gangs are based in Europe. They're not based in the United Kingdom. The travel from France to the United Kingdom is the last step of their journey. They've already come from Syria or wherever it is, through Italy, the Balkans, and up across Europe because of the Schengen zone, which makes travel in Europe so easy, to Calais. And once they're put on those dinghies, the smuggling gangs have nothing to do with them. They make that journey on their own. So the Border Security Command theory is just a theory. It's never going to work. Keir Starmer says he's working, in cooperation with European countries to break the people smuggling gangs. But the European countries, to the extent that they were able or inclined to do that, were already doing it. And I can't see what benefit the United Kingdom can, bring to that equation. Then the other big issue, which he hasn't addressed and which you touched on, is that in the United Kingdom, we spend about £50,000 per annum per head on every illegal migrant. In France, they don't get put up in 4-star hotels. They don't get free medical care, free dental care, cash in their back pockets, an iPad, and all the rest of the stuff that we give them. They stay in camps. And the average spend per head in France is £5,000. So you've got a massive economic pull to leave France at £5,000 a head, to come to the UK at £50,000 per head. So they're making no effort in order to use the economic drivers to, close that movement of people. And then the last thing, I suppose, which I should mention, is that border enforcement can never be delivered through deportation programs. Deportation is what you do when border enforcement hasn't worked. And collectively, Western civilization seems to have forgotten the crucial importance of border enforcement, which is a physical process at your border. It is not a legal process. It is a physical process. You already have the right to enforce your border. And what Italy is, I think, beginning to do, thankfully, but what Europe needs to relearn is that the Schengen zone is wrong, that you can't have freedom of movement of people and expect illegal migration to be somehow capable of being controlled. And what the United Kingdom needs to recognize is that we've got to enforce our border at the point that French territorial waters meet our territorial waters. And we need to develop, for example, something like what the Belgians did, which is a highly trained, dedicated force that uses drones, barricades, sensors, and so on, to anticipate these dinghies leaving Belgian shores, leaving French shores, as far as we're concerned, and intercepting them on the edge of our territorial waters and requiring them to go back to France, which is we're entitled to do under international law. Then the argument comes, well, what if these people self-harm themselves? They stab their dinghies, they end up in the water. You have to rescue them. The minute they're on a British boat, they're protected by British law and you're back in the same problem. Well, it's easy. You give them another dinghy, and if necessary, you handcuff them in that dinghy and you require them to go back. But it's a physical process. These people have made this journey with the support of people smugglers, but they're doing it willingly. They're safe in France, and we need to push back. And if we can push back against France, I hope, would then in turn push back against the countries from which these people are entering France. And borders would then hopefully be, reinstated. And what we've just got to relearn, and I'll stop after saying, what we've got to relearn is border enforcement is a prerequisite if the nation states of Western civilization are to survive.
Thank you for that, Ben. Now, if you want to ask a question, please jump in. Put your hand up in the Zoom so I can see you and I'll come to you. But to keep on with immigration, I think a key to sovereignty is the ability to be able to control your borders, which you've just alluded to. But Keir Starmer has just come out and called or has said that the immigration policy in Britain has failed, and he said it's happened by design, which was very interesting that he said that. It seems to be happening and failing by design across the Western world. We're facing immigration issues here in Australia. It's been a big issue in America in the recent election with their southern border. If this is all by design, where has this come from? Why has the Western world failed so badly on immigration?
So I think that Keir Starmer was referring to legal immigration by design, because they had the embarrassment of having to increase the net migration figures for 2023 from 740,000 to just over 906,000. I don't know how you can lose 150,000 people in the statistics. It's remarkable. But I think the essence, but the question is absolutely pertinent. It's legal and illegal migration. And it comes back to this liberal global order to which I referred in my opening remarks. And under this liberal global order, which the Labour Party and very large parts of the Conservative Party have bought into, every human being is equal to every other human being. And it's the liberal right of individuals to do that which they please, which is partly what also underpins the ridiculous ideology of transgender. You know, if you want to be a man and you're a woman, you can be a man. And if you want to be a woman and you're a man, you can identify as a woman. But the essence of it is that the rights of the individual trump all else. And if you can get your mind to believing that, then immigrants' rights are equal to British citizens' rights. They have every right, in every respect, on the same level as British citizens. And I think that's where the liberal global order has somehow wrongly got itself. And in accepting that argument that every immigrant's right is equal to a British citizen's right, what the British government has done is basically do away with the notion of a nation state. Because as you rightly said, nation states require borders, but they also require that their citizenry are protected and promoted over and above the other citizens of the world. And I mean, it's curious, in order now to justify that the minorities in this country who've come from abroad should be given rights equal to British citizens, they're now referred to by many parts of our commentariat as the global majority, somehow trying to legitimize their democratic right. But when you give immigrants the same rights as British citizens, you're effectively going against the democracy that is the United Kingdom. You're going against the majority interest in the United Kingdom, which is the interest of the British people. So this liberal global order has given rise to this notion, this false notion that immigrants should be afforded all the same rights and benefits as your citizens. And that liberal global order, that notion that immigrants have every equal right, stands, in my view, in direct opposition to our democracy and to the majority interests of the people in this country, and indeed in other nation states in Western civilization. And I hope that the US will be the first to really reject that ideology.
Thank you for that. We've got a question in the YouTube chat. This is a bit of a contentious question, so feel free to fire up on this one. John Murray is asking this: why is someone who voted for a withdrawal agreement, including the Northern Ireland Protocol, now blaming it on someone else?
I'm not blaming it on someone else. I'm not seeking to do it. By the time I voted on the withdrawal agreement in the European Parliament, it had already gone through approval by the British people, because Boris Johnson was elected in the United Kingdom on the promise of delivering his withdrawal agreement, and it had already been approved by the British Parliament. So in the European Parliament, if the Brexit Party had voted against it, and by the way, we had a big debate, the Brexit Party MEPs, we had a big debate before we voted. Many of us, including myself, by the way, wanted to vote against it. But we settled on us voting in favour of the withdrawal agreement because, one, it had got the democratic mandate from the British people and the British Parliament, and two, if we had voted against the withdrawal agreement, it would have made no difference because it was going to be carried by a massive majority in the European Parliament, which in itself, by the way, is testimony to the fact that the withdrawal agreement was bad because the European Parliament was in favour of it. And three, and this is a lesser point, but it was one that we considered at the time, was that we would be castigated in the media as the Brexit party voting against Brexit. But being absolutely candid, if I could have my time again, I would press the reject button in the European Parliament.
Very good. Thank you for that. You handled that well, so it wasn't maybe as contentious as I probably thought. But
No.
let's. I know this is going to be at the tip of everyone's tongue because recently, just this week, you've come out and left the Reform UK Party. Now, I myself was kicked out of the Liberal Party here in Australia only a couple of weeks ago as well. So I completely understand how you probably feel right now. And I feel that a lot of the parties across the Western world can easily be taken over by self-interest. You get a lot of good people when they're wanting to do good, but there's a lot of people with their own ambitions who try and push those people out of the way. Do you think that we need to do something about the party system across the Western world? I know in the Australian Constitution, there's no mention of political parties, but currently there's no way of getting around them. Like you almost have to be part of a party to get elected. Do you have any ideas on reforming our system to maybe lessen the power that political parties have?
So, I mean, it's a really great question. And I think without dwelling on my particular issues with Reform UK, and we can go there if you want to, but for the purposes of this discussion, I don't think I'll go there. I think political parties are damaging to democracies because essentially what you have to do as a parliamentarian is toe the party line, even if you disagree with what's being proposed. And in the process of towing party lines, what you end up with is a dumbing down of free speech in Parliament, and you end up with a dumbing down of, therefore, of democracy. And really, ideally, what one would like, I think, is 650 MPs, which is roughly what we've got, give or take the Sinn Féin lot who don't take their seats, but 650 MPs all making the case that they wish to have made, and someone emerging on each issue as the individual who can carry the issue, so that every issue is debated freely and openly by the MPs. That may be idealistic because you would have a pretty anarchic form of debate in Parliament. But I think, really that would be the ideal. And maybe there's some mechanism by which you can get a happy middle ground where you've got some kind of order, but without the kind of dumbing down of debate that I think we do have as a result of political parties. And it's not just the dumbing down of debate, by the way, because political parties behave the way they do, they tend to choose people whom they can control more easily when it comes to three-line whips and so on. And so if you look at the front bench of the Labour Party, for example, there's no one in there with business experience. No one. The business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has no business experience. And so they're not free thinkers. They're party apparatchiks. They've gone through the party process. Many of them have done nothing other than go to university, probably Oxford, get a degree in politics, philosophy and economics, and then work for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. That's not a mechanism to get the best people forward. So, I mean, I completely wholeheartedly agree with you. I don't have a ready answer to it.
Can I, Stephen, if you don't mind, just step in with a very British question for Ben? I know this is tricky ground for you at the moment, but you'll forgive me, I have to ask. Reform UK, for our global listeners, has become the fastest growing political party in the UK in terms of membership. I think I'm right in saying that, although actual membership numbers are kept pretty secret, but it looks that way at the moment. And you decided last week enough was enough, effectively, that you could no longer associate yourself with the Reform Party. You made a very eloquent video, which we will be posting up following this interview. But I have to ask you this, and you'll forgive me, but Nigel Farage, in an interview on GB News at the end of last week, referred to your quitting the party as being what he called a champagne moment. So my question to you is, did you open a bottle of Bolly after you made your decision? Because it was your decision.
Yeah, I didn't open a bottle of Bolly. If people watch the video that I did on Thursday morning explaining my reasons for leaving, I start by saying I'm saddened. And I am very saddened because the rapid rise of reform, if I may be so self-promoting, at the risk of being self-promoting, the rapid rise of reform has, quite a bit to do with me. I was deputy leader and I helped put reform on the map. We went from 6% in the polls when I joined the party to 16% just before the general election. And I think we got 14% of the votes in the general election. But my leaving reform had nothing to do with, I think Nigel then went on GB News to say that I was bitter, and I was bitter because he'd sacked me as deputy leader. My leaving reform was as a result of some historical issues, which I can go into, including Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is at the core of one of the reasons I had to leave Reform, the Northern Ireland Protocol and Reform's position on Northern Ireland. But at the heart of it was the fact that Reform isn't a proper political party. It is a limited liability company, and there are, in fact, only two members. You talked about rapidly growing membership. Actually, the correct way to describe it would be rapidly growing subscribers, because when you sign up to Reform, you pay your 25 quid and you get the right to receive an email. You don't get the right to vote on anything. Now, Nigel had promised to change this. He promised to change the the company that is limited by shares and which he and Richard Tice own, to a company limited by guarantee, which would then be opened up to them to the subscribers, who would then become genuine members. He also promised to institute a constitution, which we can go into in detail if you like. I don't think I think it's a bad document, but fundamentally, you can't convert a company limited by shares to one limited by guarantee. You would need to set up a new company. It's not legally possible to make that conversion. No new company has been set up. No new applications have been made to the Electoral Commission in the United Kingdom to register a new company in the way that Nigel promised he would do it. And the new constitution, such as it is, also hasn't had an application made to have it adopted by the Electoral Commission, approved by the Electoral Commission, and therefore capable of being implemented by the party. So he hasn't democratized the party. And I have serious doubts whether that will ever happen. And I don't think that it is intellectually or ideologically coherent to be making the case for the democratic unit that is the United Kingdom, banging the drum of the importance of the British people being able to direct those who lead the United Kingdom in their actions, but simultaneously saying, I'm not prepared to be directed by my membership. And so I'm controlling them. And I hope that in the fullness of time, I will be proven to be wrong, and that Nigel will democratize the party, that it will become a proper political party with proper members who can direct the leadership to some extent with the appropriate checks and balances in place to, follow the will of the membership. But at the moment, and from everything I've seen, including the misrepresentations made by Zia Youssef on the subject and the misrepresentations made by Nigel, I'm not confident that will happen. But the final straw for me for leaving the party, Lee, was my being banned by the HQ of Reform from meeting grassroots members of so-called members, subscribers, promoters, campaigners across the country. And when I heard that I was being banned, I was being silenced, I thought, well, that, enough is enough. If they don't want me to speak, if I'm not even allowed to speak, to people in the party, then, it's time I left. So no doubt it was a champagne moment for Nigel, but it wasn't one for me.
And if I can just pursue that for our audience's point of view, you originally turned me down for an invitation to appear today. And the reason we invited you is because we consider you something of an expert on Northern Ireland. For somebody that is not from the province of Northern Ireland, you have been quite an outstanding campaigner for that. Well, I think it's about 1.9 million citizens in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think the British citizenry maybe just over 1 million. There are 1.9 million people living there, but I think British citizens are just about 1.1 or 1.2 million.
Yeah, but it's a population of about 1.9 million.
Yeah, correct.
Over 1 million in terms of British citizens there, and it's fair to say that if for somebody who is from outside the province, you have been a major voice on this. And we, the groups that I represent, happen to think that Northern Ireland is a totemic issue for independent sovereignty and democracy around the world, and which is why we do have people from the other side of the globe with us today. Your decision, you didn't make it quickly, did you? So was it in fact the decision that you found that you were being banned from speaking? Because when I first approached you, you had an engagement today to speak to supporters of the party, did you not? And
yes, I should be in Runcorn at the moment.
Runcorn in Cheshire, exactly,
Yeah.
which is for our global audience, that's in the north of England, nice part of the world, and that's where you were going to be. And the only reason you're talking to us today is because you were stopped from speaking to the supporters of the party. So you were no longer able to go to that event. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. And I had half a dozen, if not more, such events lined up during the course of tail end of November and December and January, and they've all been cancelled.
Right. And how were you informed?
I wasn't informed. There was no formal information passed to me. It's just that I was called by a couple of the organisers of these events and saying, sorry, we've had to cancel it. HQ says we're not allowed to have you. So I said, well, could you kindly get that confirmed by someone that I recognise in HQ? And Richard Tice confirmed it to them. So, once I got that confirmation, I knew that there's no room for me in the party. But, one of the there was no room for me in the party. But one of the reasons I was at odds with Nigel, and I am at odds with Nigel on this, and with the party, is that Nigel is of the view that Brexit's done, and I'm of the view that you cannot have Brexit with Northern Ireland left in the European Union and with a border down the Irish Sea, because we voted for the United Kingdom to leave. Nigel is also of the view that a united Ireland, in other words, bringing Northern Ireland into the Republic, is inevitable. And I absolutely reject that inevitability. And some of the viewers on this chat, some of the participants on this chat may recall that we had an alliance with the traditional Unionist voice. And you heard from Jim Allister and Dan Boucher, who are of the TUV. When I say we, Reform UK had an alliance, which I brokered with Jim Allister. And we were going to fight together the general election. And during the course of the general election, Nigel endorsed Ian Paisley and Sammy Wilson of the DUP. And the DUP had done the dirty on Northern Ireland by coming up with the notion that the Irish Sea border somehow didn't exist because they'd got a promise of safeguarding the union from Rishi Sunak. And so when, it was absolutely absurd to me that Nigel was endorsing candidates in Northern Ireland which were standing against our allies in the traditional Unionist voice. And so my decision to leave the party isn't one, as you rightly say, Lee, that was made in a knee-jerk reaction over a period of 24 hours. This has been long in the coming. Actually, I knew when Nigel came back as leader that there were going to be issues, because I already knew that he says Brexit's done and I say it's not done. And I wouldn't have joined Reform without the declaration from Richard Tice, who was then leader, which he put in writing, that Brexit isn't done. I agree with you, Ben, Brexit's not done, and we will continue to fight for Northern Ireland. And I got a declaration from Richard that we would fight for Northern Ireland. And that's all in a letter. And Nigel effectively repudiated that letter when he came back as leader, because he is of the view, and he can put me right if he wants to, he is of the view, he said it many times, that Brexit's done. And then he endorsed our opponents in the general election, contrary to the agreement I had with Richard and with Jim Allister. And that makes things very, very difficult, as I'm sure you appreciate, Lee.
Nigel's had a few fairly strong things to say about you in the last few days. You've maintained, from what I can see, a fairly dignified silence. But here is your opportunity to speak to Nigel direct. What would you like to say to him about what he said about you?
Well, he has said a couple of things about me. He said that I've attacked him personally. I haven't attacked Nigel personally. I challenge him to find any attacks I've made on him personally. Yes, I have attacked his position on Northern Ireland. I've attacked his position on Brexit. I've attacked his acceptance of the rapid demographic change in the country. I disagree with him on mass deportations. I think mass deportations should take place. And we've got some other ideological differences. And I disagree with him on the constitution of the party, seemingly. But it's not personal. And actually, every party should be capable of having these discussions. He would argue that I've made it all very public and, I shouldn't have done that. But believe me, Lee, and everyone else on this chat, before I went public, there was a lot going on privately. And, if you can't prevail privately, and you've got no mechanism to prevail, because actually Nigel and Richard own the party, the only way to do it is through the public domain where I've got a voice. And so I've been making the case for Brexit, for Northern Ireland, for the democratisation of Reform UK in the public domain. He also said I'm bitter because he sacked me as deputy leader. I'm not bitter at all about being sacked as deputy leader. If Reform UK does democratise, if Reform UK can move forward as a proper political party, actually I will absent myself from politics, because I don't really want to be in politics. I'm only in politics. I'm only got into politics to get Brexit done. And I've stayed in politics because I've discovered that Western civilization, including the United Kingdom, I think is facing an existential threat by this kind of liberal global order, which I'm kicking back against. But if Nigel can create out of Reform UK a party that can rescue the United Kingdom, then my job is done and I can leave. And I would gladly go back to my full-time day job, which is running a property company.
So no words in response to Nigel?
But those are my words in response. What do you mean? What would you like me to respond to that I haven't addressed?
I don't know. He referred to blazing a glass of champagne. How did you feel about Nigel's comments when you read them? Surely you were a little shocked, were you not?
I mean, I've been in politics too long. I'm quite thick-skinned, I suppose, after that. It's like, fine, Nigel, great. Have a glass of champagne, terrific. Cheers.
Can I just cut in, because I think you've been handling this very eloquently, but also very honestly. And you mentioned how Nigel Farage said that you were bitter. Well, he actually went on to say that you're bitter and twisted, which is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary comment, especially from me sitting here in Australia and watching from afar. It almost makes him look bitter and twisted by saying that when you're being so eloquent about it. Why couldn't he have just wished you well and be done with it? Why does he have to attack you?
I don't know. I think he had a bad day. He'd also been cornered by Sky News over James McMurdoch earlier in the day. I don't know if you followed that story. And James McMurdoch is one of the 5 Reform UK MPs, and it now has come to light that he was jailed 20 years ago. We knew that he'd been jailed 20 years ago, but it's James McMurdoch had explained that he'd had an argument with his girlfriend, and he'd been arrested and jailed. It now came to light in the last 72 hours or so that he'd actually kicked his girlfriend while she was on the floor, and repeatedly kicked her. Apparently, I don't know. And Nigel was challenged during a press conference earlier in the day on James McMurdoch, and Nigel said, "Well, the vetting during the election was very poor." And of course, Nigel inadvertently, by saying the vetting was poor, inadvertently threw James McMurdoch under a bus, because what he was implying was James McMurdoch wouldn't have made the cut. Are you with me? And then so Sky News went on to ask Nigel, well, if you were doing the vetting, would he now be an MP? And Nigel stormed off. And then I think so my leaving the party, that incident, and he'd hoped it would be a good day because he was announcing Andrea Jenkins joining the party. He was probably a bit pissed off. He was on Sky, he was on GB News, and Michelle Dewberry asked him, Michelle, who I like enormously and get on very well with, asked him, so what's going on with Ben? And I think he was like, well, I'll have a glass of champagne. I think that was a kind of knee-jerk reaction.
Ben, let me just intervene for our global audience. Andrea Jenkins, for the global audience, Dame Andrea, was a Conservative MP, and on the day that you should we say quit the party, just the short form, she announced that she was moving from the Conservative Party to Reform, which was a big moment for Nigel and for the rest of the party. I think that would be fair to say. So when you refer to Andrea Jenkins to the global audience, she was elevated to the Lords after she lost her seat in Parliament, former Conservative MP, and has now moved over. And it's quite big news in the UK, fairly big anyway, in the UK, that she's moved across to Reform. Sorry, Stephen, back to you to take control.
Sorry. Can I just say, I'm afraid I've got to go because I'm on GB News at 1:00 and I've got to get there and get ready for that. So do you mind if
we're far more important than GB News. No. You did warn us in advance, and can I just say, on a personal level, thank you so much. I know that it was tricky for you to attend today, but we appreciate it. And I don't know about the audience, but it's been very, very interesting listening to what you had to say. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone for listening. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Stephen. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye.
So hopefully we can move across back to Dan. Thank you, Dan, for being so patient. I hope you understand.
Sorry, Dan. That was very rude of us. But
well, shall I carry on? I was just got a couple more things to say and then go to questions. Is that what?
Yeah, go ahead. Go right ahead.
I think you wrapped up an awful lot of stuff. If you've got something to conclude on, and then let's go to questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things I was going to say was why are we here? And the reason why we're here is because of the argument that has been deployed by the European Union about the Good Friday Agreement. It has persuaded the world that having a border across the island of Ireland, where the border is contrary to the Good Friday Agreement, and that is the imperative. That means we have to have a border down the Irish Sea, which is their accomplishment in persuading the world that's what the Good Friday Agreement says is quite extraordinary, because the Good Friday Agreement does not say that. If you actually read what the Good Friday Agreement says, in fact, the Good Friday Agreement has made the border across the island of Ireland more real than it was before 1998. The area of tension between the UK and the Republic of Ireland was that up until that point in time, the Republic of Ireland did not recognise the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom because its own constitution laid claim to Northern Ireland. And the Good Friday Agreement provided a mechanism whereby, in return for the UK government saying that provision would be made for a border poll, a referendum such that if ever the people of Northern Ireland wished to leave the United Kingdom and become part of the Republic of Ireland, that could happen. That in the context of the UK government making provision for that, if polling ever suggests that that is what the majority of people in Northern Ireland wish, that the Republic of Ireland would stop laying claim to Northern Ireland in the intervening period, or unless and until such a time as the people of Northern Ireland decided they actually wanted to leave the UK and become part of the Republic of Ireland. So the point of the Good Friday Agreement was that after it, the border became more real rather than less real, more recognised rather than less recognised. And so the argument that somehow the Good Friday Agreement makes the border less real, such that we can't possibly recognise the border where the border is curious. But it's also deeply problematic because the Good Friday Agreement says there cannot be, and the key words are any change in the constitutional status of the Northern Ireland without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. And the change that we're looking at here is a very clear change in constitutional status because it moves Northern Ireland from being a full part of the UK democracy to becoming what is effectively an EU colony. This is a very significant constitutional change which has never been put to the people of Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement also contains within it this requirement that if ever a decision is made at Stormont, the Parliament of Northern Ireland, and either community objects to that decision being made on the basis of a majority vote, that it has to be made on the basis of a voting mechanism which requires a majority approval from both communities, from both Unionists, those who wish to remain part of the UK, and Nationalists, those who wish to become part of the Republic of Ireland. And the protocol removes that requirement in relationship to a vote at Stormont on itself, on the protocol. And so provision has been made for that decision to be dealt with on a majority basis, contrary to the Good Friday Agreement. And then the third thing that's in the Good Friday Agreement, which the protocol or Windsor Framework violates, is a commitment, a human right commitment, which is expressed as the right to pursue democratically national and political aspirations. Well, that right was conveyed on the people of Northern Ireland in 1998. With a commitment that it should be upheld from that point. But we can only understand what that means if we look at the rights that people enjoyed democratically in 1998. Well, at that time, the people of Northern Ireland had the right to elect people to make all the laws to which they were subject. And so you could only uphold that right by making sure that going forward, they continue to have the right to make all the laws to which they are subject. And that is not what has happened. Obviously, we've been subject to a significant erosion of the right to make the laws to which we're subject. So on free bases, the Good Friday Agreement has been violated. And the actual basis upon which they suggest that the border down the Irish Sea must be applied and does not exist in the Good Friday Agreement because there's nothing to say that there cannot be a customs border across the island of Ireland. Well, obviously, Jim's bill has been carefully designed so we don't need to have hard border infrastructure across the island of Ireland, but it does recognise the border where the border is. But that is one of the reasons why people get confused about the Good Friday Agreement. So it's just good to just clarify that.
Yeah, I mean, what we need to do is widen this to the global audience, Dan, and the significant fact in all of this is that Northern Irish people are denied the right to vote for politicians who can vote on the laws that govern them. Is that not right?
That's correct. But the European Union, in trying to defend why that should not be the case, has said basically the Good Friday Agreement is provides an imperative for why that cannot be the case. And that is their justification. If it wasn't for the Good Friday Agreement, they would have no justification, but that is their moral justification for doing what they're doing. The problem is that their characterisation of the Good Friday Agreement is inaccurate. But their amazing achievement is they've managed to persuade the world to believe that the Good Friday Agreement means that there can't be a border where the border is.
Yes. So to what extent do you think that Northern Irish politicians, the Unionist politicians, have failed in their attempt to persuade the rest of the world? Because I agree with your assessment. The rest of the world still follows the EU line on this, which is all about preserving the Good Friday Agreement, ostensibly, whereas in reality, it was a punishment beating for the UK in annexing part of the United Kingdom, which is effectively what they've done. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the difficulties in the Northern Ireland context is that we are a divided society. And those who are nationalists have been very happy to say that this is exactly what the Good Friday Agreement requires, and that having a border across the island of Ireland is a terrible thing to happen, and it is not allowed under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And so obviously it can be quite confusing for people looking into Northern Ireland when you hear Northern Ireland parliamentarians saying completely contradictory things. But you have to factor into your assessment of that you have people who are speaking for different communities within Northern Ireland who have completely different objectives. And obviously Sinn Féin has not taken its seat in Northern Ireland, in Westminster, for over 100 years. So they have been happy, if you like, to sacrifice their democratic rights to have a voice in order for what they regard as the bigger objective, which is to remove the entirety of the island of Ireland from the United Kingdom.
Can I just jump in, because we do have a question about Sinn Féin from Lorena. Sinn Féin MPs don't even sit in the House of Commons. They're elected but never go to London. If they're claiming payments for something they're not doing, shouldn't they be held to account? And why do they run in the first place?
Well, they would run in the first place because they want to be MPs, but they don't want to be MPs that take their seats. They want to be MPs because they want to demonstrate, I guess, to the world that they represent part of the Northern Ireland that wants to actually leave the United Kingdom, become part of the Republic of Ireland. They don't get paid salaries because they don't turn up and do their job, but they get paid expenses. And because they don't actually do their job, the fact that they get paid expenses is curious. But obviously, for over 100 years, they have stood in elections to try and make the point that the constituency that they represent wants out of the United Kingdom. But the key thing to remember in all of that is that polling continues to show that the majority of people living in Northern Ireland still want to be part of the United Kingdom and being in relationship with England, Wales and Scotland. And at a time where, there's a bit of it's I guess more regarded as more progressive to be in relationship. Unionism is actually quite a sort of a forward-thinking idea because it's all about people being in relationship and celebrating the relationship that exists between England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And obviously, once upon a time, it was the whole of Ireland. But since partition in 1921, the Republic has gone its separate way.
Okay, we've got a question from Bruce. Take it away, Bruce.
Thank you. Sorry to inflict myself upon you all again, but so Dan, I've been listening a lot recently, particularly to Dr. David Starkey and others talking about the gerrymandering that happened during the New Labour years on the Constitution, and one of those things was devolution itself. The recent talk of imposing a great restoration to undo much of what New Labour did. I mean, would you agree and be in favour of reversing devolution altogether?
I think that devolution has not worked in the sense that the argument for it was if you give England, Wales, Scotland Northern Ireland more autonomy, that will make the desire for separatism to go away. And I think what we've seen actually is that you provide some devolution, you create various elites that service devolved governments that tend to then want more and more and more and more and more. So rather than it being something that can be limited, it kind of tends to sort of carry on pushing in a particular direction. I personally don't have any difficulty with the idea of local parliaments, if you like, but the difficulty practically seems to me to be that it rather than it being something that is stable in the sense that you just have it to a limited degree, there tends to be this desire to keep on going, and it's like a road that you go down and keep on moving down, and people don't tend to stop partway down the road. And I'm not quite sure. I personally think that I don't have an issue with the idea, particularly union. We're not a unitary state in the sense that we're all collapsed into an identikit identity. I think that's part of the strength of the United Kingdom as a union, that England is different from Wales and different from Scotland and different from Northern Ireland, and yet we're all in relationship with each other. I don't feel if I'm in England, if I'm in London, or if I'm in Belfast or Edinburgh or Cardiff, I don't feel that I'm ever in a foreign place, but I do feel that I'm in a different place. And if you're committed to the idea of the union as a relationship between the different parts of the UK, rather than seeing it as sort of a uniform, unitary thing, then obviously one celebrates and recognises the importance of those differences. And I would, in principle, have no issue with a measure of devolution that gives expression to local diversity, if you like. My question, my issue would be more about how do you set that up in a way that doesn't make it into a road that leads to separatism. And I'm a unionist. I believe very much in the relationship.
Well, the original act of union with Scotland, it gave power to Scotland in the same way that Northern Ireland has it in Westminster. That was the deal, and nothing else was touched. It allowed the Scots to have their own church, their own law, etc. But they had this representation in Westminster, and that was what drove the union. So this devolution process has done exactly what you said, which has set us on this path of separatism, which is very hard to wind back in. So.
And obviously, in the Northern Ireland context, the Unionist community never looked for devolution. Northern Ireland devolution began in 1921, not because Unionists wanted it, but because a partition meant that what had been passed in terms of the act that sought to provide home rule for Ireland could at that point only be applied to the bit of that remained, fully in the UK after partition. So it's a slightly ironic situation that between 1921 and 1972, the only part of the UK to have devolved government was the bit that didn't really want it. It was a slightly strange scenario, and one of the reasons why aspects of unionism, some of them were not unhappy when the Parliament of Northern Ireland was brought to an end. But one of the strange things that we are seeing now, if you're talking about gerrymandering, is the way in which the EU essentially have gerrymandered the Good Friday Agreement because they are imposing majority voting again on Stormont. And we are, within the next 3 weeks, looking at a vote at which Stormont will be asked to approve the imposition of the protocol on Northern Ireland. And that vote will happen on a majority basis. It's the most controversial proposition to have ever come before the Northern Ireland Assembly since 1921, and it's happening on a majority basis. The first controversial majority vote for 50 years.
I just need to interject there. For the global audience, Stormont is not something that people know of around the world. Stormont is effectively the local parliament, what's called the Northern Ireland Assembly, within Northern Ireland, and it is based in a place called Stormont, Beautiful building, by the way. I've been there. But that is what Stormont is. So for the benefit of our audience worldwide, when you talk about Stormont, that's what you're talking about, is the locally elected representatives within Northern Ireland. They're not elected to the House of Commons in the UK, or at least some of them are. Jim, for example, our first speaker, Jim Allister, he is now an MP. Sitting in the House of Commons in Westminster. There are, I think, 5 DUP MPs from Northern Ireland, and there are 2 more that are independent, I think.
There are 2 more Unionists that are...
yes. Beg your pardon. Yes, Unionists who are effectively independent MPs.
One of them is from the old...
Clarify that, because we don't want to make this too specific about Northern Ireland. This is, the points we're talking about here are generic around the world, that you simply cannot have a section of the country that is parcelled off, ruled under foreign laws by a foreign empire.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom has been violated, and the extraordinary thing is our own government has agreed to it.
Yeah. So now I'm going to pass back to Stephen, because we're almost half an hour over time, Stephen, and you may want to start. Any questions for Dan, and then we need to start wrapping up. No?
Yeah, let's squeeze in one more question. This is from Peter in the chat, and this is probably a good way to finish off, Dan. Has Northern Ireland been used as an example to deter other countries from leaving the EU?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that the EU, it would see how it would be very convenient for the EU to say to a member state that was considering leaving, if they could say, well, you remember what happened to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland that tried to leave the European Union? It no longer exists. Would be a fairly salutary warning across the bows.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear, isn't it?
Mm.
Okay, well, look, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you everyone who has participated tonight. I know Lee will probably finish things off, but before we get there, I just want to remind everyone again about the website that Jim Allister and Dan Boucher have been discussing or have set up in regards to their bill. It's this one here, restoretheunion.co.uk, and they're encouraging you all to go there if you've agreed with what they've said, and just scroll down. There's 3 letters, the templates that they've already set up for you to email your MP to encourage them to vote for this bill on December 6th. So please head to the website. Again, it is restoretheunion.co.uk, and submit one of those letters to your local MP and get some support behind this bill. Is that exactly what you need, Dan?
Absolutely, yeah. Particularly people living in Great Britain, England, Wales, or Scotland. It'd be really, really, really helpful to just let the MPs know that they, as people living in England, Wales, and Scotland, want them to turn up on Friday to speak and vote in favour of the bill.
Yeah, very, very good. We've just had a misinformation and disinformation bill go down here in Australia, and a big part of that was because so many people in this country emailed their local members and senators to stop the bill, and it was really down to the Australian people that stopped the bill, not the parliamentarians. So if you can use your power that you have by bombarding your local MP, telling them to support this bill, who knows what could happen. It's really people power at the end of the day. But in regards to this, we'd better wrap up. If you do want to be a part of this in the future, as I said, you need to subscribe to either factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. Head to one of those websites or all 3 of them, sign up, and you'll get the next Zoom link. I'm sure we'll have a great host of guests lined up in the near future in the next global discussion forums. But to finish off, I'll pass it back to Lee, and you can finish up, mate.
Well, I think you've done an excellent summary there, Stephen, if I may say. It only remains for me to thank our speakers, Jim Allister, who I know was incredibly busy today. Well, in fact, all of our guests have been, and they've managed to fit this in for everyone. So thank you to Jim. Thank you also to Dan Boucher, a good friend, who I think has covered off some very interesting points, maybe a little difficult to digest for some of the worldwide audience, but nevertheless, important stuff. And we will be putting this out next week. And my final thank you clearly goes to our mystery special guest star that we couldn't reveal until the last moment. And somehow or other, despite the fact that the entire British media were trying to get hold of him, we got him. And so we're quite proud of that. So we want to thank him too. And thank you, Stephen. Once again, magnificent job in curating this whole thing, keeping it all on track. Ben, I don't know if you want to say something.
Well, just to say thank you all very much indeed for coming. To Dan, a very informative and detailed analysis of what's going on in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for that. To you, Stephen, thank you for chairing this, and to our guests as well. Very distinguished guests, Jim Allister and Ben Habib. So I'd just like to reiterate what Lee has said. Thank all our guests, and thank you, your audience, for coming along and taking part as well. We will be posting this meeting up on our website very shortly, so you'll be very welcome to look at that. And please spread the word to other people who also might be interested. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. We'll just to echo that, this will go up on the Facts for EU site. It will go up on the so that's Facts4 EU.org. It will also go up on the cibuk.org website. And I think, Stephen, you're planning to put something on the commandingthenarrative.com website, are you not?
Yeah, that's correct. It will be there as well, and all across all our platforms. So it will go to a global audience. But Lee, to give you some time to end the stream, I'll just read out some of the support that we received in the chat. Some of this is directed at you, Dan, and our other speakers. So thank you very much. AJ says, thank you for a fascinating and very informative discussion. Peter says, thank you. Alan says, thank you. Great discussion. And Anthony says, well done. An excellent discussion. So a lot of support in the chat about what we've discussed here today.
That's great, and it's wonderful to see support from right around the world for something that is a pretty iconic issue, I would say. And it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. I think at the end of the week, just to summarise, what will happen is the Labour Party will be mobilised, the Labour MPs will be mobilised to vote again. So I think this particular bill will unfortunately fail, but we've done our bit today, as have our guest speakers, in raising the profile of this very important issue, which is fundamental. It is whether or not people should have the right to be governed by governments that can actually make their laws. And in Northern Ireland, that is currently not the case. And that is quite wrong. So if you feel that it's wrong for a part of a sovereign country to be sectioned off, if you like, by a foreign empire and governed under its rules, if you think that's wrong, then please let us know. And you can do that by contacting any of the organizations that I've mentioned. So thank you for coming along today. I'm going to pass you back to Stephen just to close off.
Well, that's it, everyone. Hope you can all join us next time. As I said, we look forward to having you back. And if you do want to participate in this again, please head to one of those three websites, factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. But for now, from Australia, from the UK, and right around the world, we'll see you all next time.